There's not a PowerPoint this morning, so if you're one that likes to see what's coming ahead or likes to see things visually, there is a note sheet in the back or at the entrance to the auditorium, so be sure and grab one of those. Let's begin with a word of prayer this morning. Our Father God in heaven, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the opportunity we have to gather this morning to study your word, to look at the book of Exodus, and to examine the things that you want us to know from it. We're thankful for the changing of the seasons and for the cooler weather, the rain that we've been receiving. God, we thank you for that blessing. God, we pray that during this holiday season that as many travel, that they might be safe, and not only on the roads, but also in the sphere of the virus, that fewer people would come down with the virus, and that more people would be able to avoid it and stay healthy from it. God, we thank you so much for your son Jesus, and it's in his name that we pray. Amen. Sounds like maybe you got a little adjusted. Maybe the feedback was there at first, but I think we're good now. Everybody sound better? Okay. All right. It's good to see you all this morning. Good to be back with you. We're going to continue in our study of Exodus. Last week, Drew began our study and gave us kind of an overview of the book of Exodus and kind of gave us a big 10,000-foot view of what God is trying to accomplish in the book of Exodus. And this morning, we're going to begin to kind of piggyback off of that, especially one of the words that he emphasized last week, and that was deliverance. And that's ultimately, at large, what the book of Exodus is really about. And as you think later on towards the New Testament, when Jews began to learn of this Messiah and the concept and the idea of salvation was presented to them, we mentioned this a couple of quarters ago in our study of the vocabulary of victory and how that word salvation for Jews would have brought to mind or made them think in the back of their mind about this deliverance account. And so this is just, the book of Exodus, particularly the beginning, is an epic story. It's such an epic story that really even Hollywood saw some profit that could be made from it, right? You think about some of the movies over the years that have been made in the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston? And even in more recent years with the Prince of Egypt, the more animated series, and how it's just a powerful story and a lot of great imagery and a lot of moving details to the story. It's something that's interesting. And some friends of ours have a podcast right now that's called The Bible is Not Boring. And certainly it's not when you think about many of the details that are there for us to read about. And so this morning, as we begin thinking about the book of Exodus, one of the main goals that God has through the book of Exodus is to reveal himself to the Egyptians and to his people. And so one of the key verses is Exodus chapter 1 and verse number 8, at least a key verse in the first chapter. I know Drew touched on this a little bit last week. It was that there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Recall that the previous book, at the very end, we have Joseph meeting his demise. He passes away, but before that, Joseph had a large influence in the kingdom of Egypt, so much so that he became second in command, if you will, and ultimately was able to help his family survive a great famine, the family that he had been estranged from for many years, not of his own doing, but of his brothers. And so here he has made an influence and impact in Egypt, one of the most powerful empires in history, even today, standing today, one of the most powerful empires in history, and Joseph had made an impact in that kingdom. And then in verse number 8, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. But really, was the issue that they didn't know Joseph? Was it that Joseph was some special character that had such amazing ability beyond someone else other than what God had given him? Certainly not. Let's turn back and look at Genesis chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41, and notice what was noticed by Pharaoh whenever Joseph was able to interpret his dreams. Genesis 41, verse number 37 and 38. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this," talking about Joseph, "a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" So they noticed that there was something special about Joseph, yes, but the most important part about it was that God was with Joseph, and they noticed that. Even those of the world noticed that. And so as we come back into Exodus chapter number 1, and we see this phrase, this new king arises or arrives, and he does not know Joseph, it's not that big of a deal that he didn't know Joseph in terms of the actual physical person, as much as it was a big deal that because he didn't know Joseph, he didn't know the God of the Israelites. And so the primary emphasis one of the primary emphases of Exodus is God trying to reveal himself to the Egyptians through what we later know as the plagues, and through ultimately all the things that he's doing in Exodus, as well as trying to reveal himself and remind the children of Israel who he is. And so one of the primary things that they needed to know about God was that he had made a promise, and that he was going to deliver on that promise. And that deliverance will be revealed and controlled by God's providential hand as we go through this study. Particularly as we mentioned God's working and delivering his people, we're going to make reference to God's providence over and over again. And so we're going to stop a couple of points along the way this morning and say, hey, look, here's God's providence, here's God's hand. Even though it may not seem like something's going on because of God, there's no other way to explain it except for him. And so if you remember from the onset, the reason the people that are in the situation that they're in is because of God's providence. We already mentioned the story of Joseph, how he was sold by his brothers and made chief in Potiphar's house. He was jailed, then released, made the right-hand man in Egypt. That those things just don't happen just on accident. Clearly, God had a plan for Joseph as he was there, and it turns out that Joseph realizes this at the end of chapter 50, in that he says, God meant it unto good. He said, you meant it, talking to his brothers, you meant it unto me unto evil, but God meant it unto me for good. And he goes on to say, to save many people alive. So what was God's plan? Well, as we said, he made a covenant with Abraham many years earlier, and that covenant, that promise, was threefold. The land promise, the seed promise, and the promise of blessing. The land promise, God promised Abraham that he would give him a new home, which we know as Palestine, or the promised land. But also the seed promise, that God promised Abraham that he would give him a son and a large family, that from his seed there would come a large family. But then ultimately the blessing promise, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed, that God promised Abraham that he would bless him and all the people of the world through Abraham, because Jesus would come through his lineage. And so God had already given the land to Abraham, but as time went on, they had to evacuate. God provided for his people in the famine through Joseph in Egypt. And through the deliverance account of Exodus, we'll see that God's providential hand is working for the purpose of preserving the blessing promise that he made to Abraham. That is, that through him providing for his people and allowing them to persist, that God is making sure that the promise that he made to Abraham about Jesus coming from his lineage would ring true and hold true in the future. But there's also, at the very beginning of Exodus chapter 1, verse number 7, we see God's providential hand working and in making sure that one of the promises, one of the threefold parts of the promise that God made to Abraham was also being fulfilled, and that was that through his seed there would be a large nation or a large family. And so notice verse number 7. Joseph had died in verse number 6, and all his brothers and all that generation, but the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Accident? Doesn't seem to be. We could definitely, hopefully, point to the fact that God's providential hand is working here in establishing and making sure that the promise is fulfilled that was made to Abraham, that through his seed there would be a large nation. And so we have God providentially working in this particular moment, so much so that by the time of the Exodus, as will come here in a few chapters, there were more than 600,000 males. More than 600,000 males who were 20 years and older. We find that in Exodus chapter 12 and verse number 37. And if we were to extrapolate that type of data and estimate how many people were in totality as far as the children of Israel were concerned in Egypt, and we were to include the women and the children in that estimate, we would arrive somewhere around 2 million or so people. God's providential hand is working to the point that when they're exiting Egypt, there are that many people that God had provided for them and made sure that his promise was holding true. And so naturally you might say that through this, because of this, the Egyptians may have begun to feel threatened. And if they've forgotten Joseph, they would likely have forgotten why that these people, these children of Israel, were even there. And so if they're feeling threatened by them and they don't know why they got there to begin with, why they were there to begin with, because they've forgotten about Joseph, then naturally they're going to perhaps begin to become territorial. They're going to think, man, these people over here in our region, they're beginning to get rather large. And if we're not careful, they're going to unite with our enemies. And notice what Pharaoh says. There arose a king of Egypt, verse number 8, who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly, verse number 10, with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. And so we have the scene that is set for us. It's important to remember, right, that the Exodus account isn't just, a few hundred people leaving Exodus. It's not just a few hundred children of Israel leaving Exodus. It's a couple of million, likely. And so it's a big deal. It's something that we need to try to keep in the back of our mind and see that large number of people, because it's setting the stage for us and what's taking place and why Pharaoh was going to go about what we'll find next in afflicting the people. Before we get there, I want us to turn back to Genesis chapter number 15. Genesis chapter number 15. We've made some observations about the promises that were made to Abraham, about his seed, about the land, about the blessing that would come through his seed. But in Genesis chapter number 15, there's another promise that's made to Abraham. The promise is that though his people would become afflicted and under bondage, that God would deliver them. Notice Genesis chapter number 15, verses 12 through 14. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. And so God promises to Abraham that he would be, that his descendants would be afflicted, that they would be under bondage for 400 years, but ultimately that he would judge that nation and they would come out of that affliction, out of that bondage with great possession, that they would be delivered. And so we have in the first place on our note sheet, deliverance foretold. That deliverance is foretold. It wasn't something that should have come as a surprise to the children of Israel. If Abraham would have told his children and their children would have told their children and so on and so forth, they would have known that at some point this would be coming. Something for us to think about today as Christians in the sense that we know that Jesus and the apostles promise us that those that live godly will suffer persecution. We're promised that, and we need to not be like the children of Israel and maybe be caught by surprise when that comes. But certainly we need to recognize that the bondage was foretold, but also the deliverance was foretold. And so let's consider next, in chapter number 1, verses 1 through 22, the deliverer needed. The deliverer needed. And so as you think about, okay, we've talked about the fact that the Egyptians, Pharaoh, I'm sorry, my throat just got dry all of a sudden. Mike could use some water if somebody might mind grabbing me something. He said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. So they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. And so we have the first part of the need for a deliverer being the affliction of the adults. The affliction of the adults in verses 9 through 11, and even verse number 12. So what was the intent of the affliction? The intent of the affliction was because they felt threatened, as we mentioned before. They didn't want them to join forces with their enemies. But the initial approach to the affliction was what? To set taskmasters, forcing them to build some supply cities. Thanks, Larry. Forgive me for just a second here. They're wanting to inflict this affliction upon them so that they would build supply cities. What are these supply cities? If we're to look at 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 19, the usage of this concept of supply cities here seems that perhaps that these supply cities were some sort of military garrison, that they were a place in which military supplies might be stored, maybe some sort of military post. And it's interesting, maybe some sort of depot for ammunition. It seems maybe that they were built even right in the middle of the land that Joseph had given the children of Israel in Genesis chapter 47, verse 11. Notice what it said about, or one of the supply cities is called Ramses. Turn back a few pages to chapter 47 of Genesis. Once Joseph's father and his brothers come to the land of Israel, notice where Joseph situates his family. So Jacob, verse number 10, blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh, and Joseph, verse number 11, situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. So we don't know for sure exactly if they just happened to call this new supply city Ramses, or if that was actually being placed in the area that the children of Israel were. But you think about how that would have been strategic for the Egyptians to do so, to demonstrate to the children of Israel as they're multiplying and growing that, look, we are in charge here. We're going to set up a military post, a military garrison to make sure you remember this is our land, that we're in charge, and that you're subordinates here. And so not only do they establish that particular garrison or that supply city, but they are also causing or forcing the children of Israel to be the ones to build those, to erect those particular structures. And so, if you want to remind someone that you're in control, one good way of going about it is to establish a military presence in the region that someone's dwelling in. But then we have the intent of the affliction, the initial approach of the affliction. Notice how the affliction intensifies, the intensification of the affliction. Because the children of Israel, even in that circumstance, continued to multiply. Notice verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. So it seems as though they are intensifying the affliction by which they're causing the children of Israel to work for them, to the point that it seems that in verse number 14, they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick and in all manner of service in the field. When I read that, it brings to mind maybe the difference between building a supply city and working in the field. You think, what's one of the worst parts about Egypt? What comes to mind? You're in scorching sun. Maybe that's what comes to your mind, right? How hot that part of the world is. And so if you're building a city, at least once you get the walls and the roof up, at least in that circumstance, you might have some shade, but now they're moving them out to the field. And they're making them work in hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and the service which made them serve was with rigor. And so we have the affliction of the adults, but that wasn't all. That wasn't all that the children of Israel needed deliverance from. So we have the affliction of the adults. Consider next the barrage on the baby boys. The barrage on the baby boys. Begin reading in verse number 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Okay, so in an effort to stem the tide of the growth of the children of Israel, not only have they started to try to afflict them with bondage and make them work with rigor, but now they're trying to kill the newborn babies by way of the Hebrew midwives. We'll talk more about the next effort to kill baby boys here in a minute, but it seems like maybe this first approach was kind of maybe on the down low. Like Pharaoh, instead of decreeing some sort of edict that says every male baby must be killed, he kind of does it on the sly by going to the midwives and saying, hey, when the babies are born, I want you to kill them. And maybe, okay, you would think, wouldn't that outrage the Hebrews? Wouldn't that outrage the children of Israel for the midwives to do that? Certainly so. And so I wonder if maybe, as I was studying this, I kind of came to a conclusion in my mind that there's perhaps this idea that maybe the midwives weren't just outright like taking a knife out and stabbing the babies, or weren't, that Pharaoh didn't command them to do that, to take a knife out and just stab the babies in front of the mothers. Instead, maybe he was asking them to do something behind the scenes, if you will. Maybe as the baby began to be birthed, they might suffocate the child. So the mother then would think, oh, maybe it just came out stillborn. And so maybe you have this first kind of down low approach from Pharaoh through the midwives to do this. And I believe that's important. We'll talk about why here in just a moment. Again, it's just my own personal musing about the situation, because again, why would Pharaoh have the midwives do it when in the end he commands that the people do it? I wonder if it has to do with trying to keep the children of Israel from revolting. Because as we said, what thing could cause more anger than the killing of people's babies? But we see that Shiphrah and Puah didn't obey the command of Pharaoh. So then they go on, as Pharaoh asked them, well, why didn't you kill him? They answer, well, they're more lively than the Egyptian women. They give birth before we can even get there. And so there's some questions that arise, maybe in your own mind, questions over the years that have arisen because of this seeming conundrum. And one of the questions people ask is, did Shiphrah and Puah sin? In one word, the answer is no. In a nutshell, we know that God dealt well with the midwives, and our God, a just God, would not reward sin. That being said, let's examine some possibilities. First question someone might have is, did they sin by not obeying the laws of the land or submitting to authority? Certainly that can be addressed by the understanding that we are to first obey God rather than men, Acts chapter 5, verse 29. We certainly should render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but it can be logically and soundly deduced that all laws that are contrary to God's laws should not be followed. And so it says very specifically that the midwives feared God, and it would follow that disobeying laws that are contrary to God's laws would not be godly, and they would be classified as fearing or respecting God if they were to actually dismiss the command that Pharaoh gave them. And so that one's an easy one to dismiss, right? Of course, they didn't sin by just by not obeying the law of the land, because it was an evil law. It wasn't righteous. However, the second question that would arise is this: did Shiphrah and Puah lie whenever Pharaoh asked them why they didn't kill the baby boys? And so, in answer to that question, they said they're lively. Before we get there, they can have them. This could easily be explained as not a lie, because it could have been easily the truth. That is, maybe they just dragged their feet and they didn't get there as quickly as they could have, and so by the time they got there, they couldn't have told the mother that the baby was stillborn. If our supposition from earlier is correct, that maybe they're trying to do it on the sly. Once the baby came out, the midwives couldn't have just gotten away with killing the baby, because the mother would have already known that the baby was live and healthy. And so they could have just dragged their feet. Now, again, even if this isn't the answer, that they dragged their feet, maybe you don't accept that. Maybe you still see that as a dishonest statement, because they weren't telling Pharaoh the whole truth. Could it not be, alternatively, that the midwives weren't telling Pharaoh anything even remotely close to a lie, in the sense that they weren't telling Pharaoh the whole truth? It could be that God actually could have caused the Hebrew women to be more lively and give birth faster than the Egyptian women. You think about inducement today, and how you induce a woman to cause her to give birth sooner than maybe that she would have through some sort of medicinal approach. Could God's providential hand not have been working here in this moment, to not have to cause Shiphrah and Puah to lie, because they feared God. They didn't want to kill these babies, and they knew that if they told Pharaoh the truth, that they weren't going to kill him, that they perhaps would have been judged by Pharaoh and perhaps even killed by Pharaoh. Could it be that God's providential hand is working here, that caused these women to give birth a little bit early, more so than the women anticipated? They couldn't have called for the midwife. And so there's certainly very much a reasonable, plausible explanation for the fact that Shiphrah and Puah did not lie, and they weren't commended for their actions in a lie that somebody might suppose is a lie. Any questions or comments or thoughts regarding that answer? Sure.
I wish, from a historical purpose, I just knew more about this. I don't understand why the Hebrews didn't have no midwives.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be that the midwives ministered to the Egyptian women first.
Sure.
I agree with you. You just don't know enough about it. But I know the mortality rate was higher, but God blessed the Hebrew women.
Sure. And that's the thing about any type of what may be perceived to be a contradiction or a, what's the word here, when you're in some sort of situational ethics, is it okay to lie in this situation? When it comes to any type of contradiction or supposed contradiction or alleged contradiction, if there is an answer that can be given that is legitimate, though we may not know for sure that that's the answer, then it's not God rewarding sin. It's not God rewarding evil. Certainly there's an explanation that is wholesome that can be given here, as you pointed out. And so, by the way, we wanted to name our baby girl after Aaron's grandmother, but her name is Bernice Ethel, and we just couldn't make it work. It's a little bit older, right? Sorry if your name is Bernice in here. But secondly, I sent Aaron a text as I was studying for this. It's not too late to change the baby's name to Shiphrah or Puah. She didn't go for that either. But these two ladies are certainly remarkable ladies and are to be held in regard for what they did and for the fact that God honored them in this situation. And so, again, as we said, let's take a moment to stop and emphasize God's providence in this circumstance. Against all odds, despite the effort to the contrary, God made the children of Israel to multiply and grow mighty, even when the Egyptians were trying to stop that. But next, notice the murder of male children. So we have the barrage on the baby boys, but ultimately the murder of male children. In response to the actions of Shiphrah and Puah, or in response to the flourishing of the children of Israel, Pharaoh throws his hands up in the air and moves to the extremes. He says, I tried to do this quietly, but I'm left with no other choice. Everybody kill your male children. So Pharaoh violently decrees to have all male children drowned in the river. So where is God in this chapter? As we've already begun to mention, he has not yet been forgotten by the descendants of Jacob. To the first-time reader of Exodus, one may wonder, why is God allowing this to happen? Maybe God had forsaken the children of Israel and was failing to keep his promise to Abraham, but not so. In fact, the midwives had not even forgotten him, even though the culture, namely the emperor around them, had forgotten God. It's an important lesson for us to remember that despite all the failings around us in our culture today, God is still in control. We can still do good in fearing him. And God rewards those who diligently seek them, and that was the case as Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6 says. God is rewarding Shiphrah and Puah as they feared God and ultimately were diligently seeking him. And so you might see the transition from Genesis to Exodus as kind of a movie, maybe or even a play in which the curtain drops and things change as the curtain opens back up. And in that moment, you have been seeing, before the curtain drops, this great big crescendo building up that God's man Joseph has risen to the top, and many great things have been happening for God's people. But then the curtain drops at this great climax, and it opens back up, and you see darkness and pain and hurting, people being afflicted. Somebody, the first-time reader, might be looking at Exodus chapter 1, and where is God in this situation? But if a person would have been noticing from Genesis chapter number 15 earlier, as we mentioned, they would have known that this was coming and that God would ultimately eventually provide a deliverer. And so at the beginning of chapter number 2, we have the deliverer is born. The deliverer is born, chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. First, let's examine the parents. The parents. A man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, and hid the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. We learn later that the names of Moses' parents are Amram and Jochebed in chapter 6, verse number 20. And in our immediate context, Moses' mother, Jochebed, is spoken of as the one who hid him, the one that devised the plan, that took the care to do all these things. But in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, it's important to notice that the parents both are commended for their faith. And that also in Acts chapter 7 and verse number 20, Stephen confirms that Amram would have known about this. And Stephen, in his sermon before he was stoned, confirms that Amram would have known about this and would have been consenting to this. And so it's not required, but it sure helps for a future leader of God to have godly parents. Not required, but it really, really does help. Obviously, Moses wasn't in the house long before he went to live in Pharaoh's daughter's household, but he continued to have that influence of his godly mother in his life as she ultimately eventually became his caretaker. So that's interesting to think about with regard to the parents. But imagine the fear that Moses' parents must have lived in for those 3 months. It reminds me of the diary of Anne Frank, in which Anne Frank and her family hid in a secret compartment in their home as the Nazis were coming and trying to take the Jews. And they hid there, and she had a diary as she wrote during that time period. Certainly the fear that was taking place in that family as they feared for their lives. It reminds me of what Jochebed and Amram must have felt in that situation. And trying to put myself in their shoes is hard to imagine. As a side note, we learn later in Exodus chapter 7, verse number 7, that Aaron, Moses' brother, is 3 years older than Moses. And we don't know the specified amount of time between when Pharaoh first had the edict to the midwives to be the ones that would kill the baby boys, to the time when he just said this is the command throughout all the land. But you kind of wonder if maybe Amram and Jochebed lived through that first edict with their first son, Aaron. And so their faith had to have been tested at that time. But you think about the faith that they must have had to have trusted in God, to be able to push Moses down the river. It certainly could have been developed in that first circumstance, maybe as they trusted in God to take care of Aaron in that circumstance. And that's what faith is, especially in new circumstances. Trusting in God because you've seen him make good on his promises to take care of his people in the past. And by the way, interestingly enough, Jochebed was obeying the letter of the law when she put Moses in the river, but she circumvented that law by putting him in a basket and pushing him down the river. And so we have some exceptional parents here, people that were full of faith, that didn't obey the laws of the land, that trusted in God, that saw the providence of God in the future that could have taken care of Moses. And why is that? Because now as we've considered the parents, let's consider the child. What's the first thing that is said about Moses? What is the attribute or the quality of Moses that's commented on here? Verse number 2. He was a beautiful child. Now, I don't know if that means that he was just, cute. A few years ago, one of the youth groupers, when I was working with the youth in St. Marcus, asked when Jackson was eventually going to be cute. Because you know how sometimes those newborn babies, they just got a little bit of odd appearance to them just because maybe they have that oblong head or whatever it may be, right? Eventually, Jackson did become cute. He was cute all along, okay? But as you think about this, are they just saying that Moses was a beautiful child, like right out of the womb, and so there was something special about him that they noticed right away? I don't know about that. In fact, in Acts chapter number 7 and verse number 20, depending on what translation you're reading, it translates it as something like beautiful in the sight of God or exceptional in the sight of God. And so it seems that maybe, again, another supposition, but maybe as Amram and Jochebed are looking at Moses as he's born, they weren't looking at his physical appearance and thinking he's beautiful like we think of the word beautiful, but rather that maybe they saw something in him that said, there's going to be something greater, or God had revealed something to them about this baby boy Moses, that he was going to be a deliverer, he was going to be great, that he'd be helpful for the people in the future. And so this child is something special. Now again, the physical appearance isn't that important because we know Jesus was like a root out of dry ground, Isaiah chapter 53 says. He wasn't something that anyone would long or desire to look after, but there's something special about Moses in this case. At some point it was decided that there was no way that she could hide the baby any longer. Why 3 months? I don't know what, after 3 months, that was the time. Maybe just the anxiety or whatever led to that at that moment. But 3 months comes and they begin to build or construct this little basket. So we have the parents, we have the child, now the basket. Can't help but place myself in the sandals of Amram and Jochebed in this situation again. How carefully I would have woven those bulrushes together. How carefully I would have been with the mixture of the pitch, the outside kind of waterproofing for that basket to ensure its waterproofness. How precise I would have been with the lid to ensure that rain and bugs would not have been able to infiltrate the basket and hurt my precious baby boy. Certainly, this was a difficult circumstance to be in for Amram and Jochebed. And then the launch. Can you imagine for just a fraction of a second the painful decision this was for Jochebed? Maybe they went to the lengths to build the basket, but then if you're like me, maybe you thought, what, forget the basket. I'm gonna hold on to it. Maybe just, say forget that. But they eventually do launch the baby boy out into the river. But the providence, again, God's hand is working through this. It doesn't say directly that God steered the boat, but what are the odds that this basket would survive the torrent of the river without God's providential hand? What are the odds that this basket would beach at the foot of Pharaoh's household? What are the odds that the person opening it would be compassionate to this baby boy? God, no doubt, knowing this was his future deliverer, used his providential hand to protect the basket in the water, to guide it safely ashore, to use the crying voice of baby Moses to melt and soften the heart of Pharaoh's daughter. What are the odds that Pharaoh's daughter would allow a young Hebrew woman to come into the household to take care of the young Moses? There's too much at play here to just ignore that God is not at work, that God is not trying to prepare a deliverer for his people who at the end of chapter number 2 begin to cry out to him. Notice at the end of chapter number 2. Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. You know what's so amazing at this moment? They started crying to God in that circumstance because of their bondage, and God had already been working to prepare a deliverer, to ease their burden, to take them out of Egypt, to deliver them back home to the promised land. Something to think about when it comes to our God, that there's not a time or a circumstance or a day in history that he has not already seen. And when we think, God, why aren't you hearing my cry? Why aren't you doing something about this? God, why aren't you working in this circumstance? God knows. He's already seen it. He's already seen it play out. In fact, he's already been working to solve it. In fact, God already solved it. every problem and difficulty that we have through his son Jesus. So some beautiful things to think about. Wiersbe powerfully put it this way: God used a baby's tears to control the heart of a powerful princess. The phrase, as weak as a baby, doesn't apply in the kingdom of God, for when the Lord wants to accomplish a mighty work, he often starts by sending a baby. This was true when he sent Isaac, Joseph, Samuel, John the Baptist, and especially Jesus. Think about this. Wiersbe says a baby's tears were God's first weapons in his warfare against Egypt. Not only had God already been working, but he was working in a way that nobody would have thought about, nobody would have expected, nobody would have planned, but God knows. God's all powerful, and he was able to put this baby boy in the right place at the right time for the right purpose, for the ultimate deliverance of his people down the road. And so we'll begin next week by talking about the second half of chapter number 2 being the deliverer prepared. The deliverer prepared. So we have the deliverer is born, second half of chapter number 2, the deliverer is prepared, and then we'll enter into chapter number 3 that the deliverer is called. Thank you for your attention this morning. Let's begin to prepare our minds for worship here in a moment.